Benjamin Gruenbaum to talk to you about the async story cancellation. Good luck.
All right, so hi everyone. I'm Benjamin. First of all, I want to say yesterday I was kind of annoyed. I had like very intricate design in my slides, and I just ripped it all off. So all my slides are going to look like this, and I'm going to see if it's like more readable because I had weird fonts and stuff. All right, so async story cancellation. I'm Benjamin. I removed the About Me slide. I work on open source and some projects. I am in Microsoft. I am happy there. We are hiring like everyone. I do want to give some disclaimers. I am going to talk about stuff I worked on in Node.js and in standards bodies here. I don't represent Node.js here. I don't represent Microsoft, and I don't represent WHATWG or TC39. I'm going to be talking about collaborative efforts. These were made by many people. I am one of those people. You can be one of those people, by the way. If anyone wants to contribute, all these are open standards bodies and projects, and you are welcome to participate. So what are we on about? The fundamental thing is we have a request. And it's a pretty simple request, right? It just hits an API, and then it hits another API. And it's very nice. It's using async await. It's relatively modern code. But many things can go wrong in surprising ways when you have a very simple flow with async await. What if the connection closes? If this is a node server, let's say I'm using Fastify, and like in the middle of the request, the connection closes. And I can be making access requests, or I can be making requests that are not relevant, or trying to write to a socket that doesn't, like that is closed. What if it becomes invalid? The user made a second, like let's say I'm writing a type ahead, an autocomplete, and the user made the request, and then they made another request. I don't care about the first request anymore in the backend. What if the server restarts? Node servers do that sometimes. There's OS updates and stuff. So there's basically many reasons cancellation is needed in regular, everyday Node.js APIs. Timeouts, that's another common one. You don't want the request to wait for too long when you do stuff. Cancellation is everywhere, and in other ecosystems, it has been everywhere in the API. And somehow we ended up in a situation where we had promises which were huge. Like, I don't know who here used Node in 2013, 14, but getting promises to core was a pain. Getting promises to JavaScript was a pain, and it required compromises. And one of those is that we didn't have a cancellation story when promises were added. So what did we do to deal with it? Basically, a mess. We had many APIs. This is XML HTTP request, one of the oldest HTTP APIs in JavaScript. Those of you who do front-end have probably seen it, hopefully not since fetch. And to cancel it, you do xhr.abort, and that's an ad hoc xhr thing. You don't abort an xhr the same way you cancel any other thing in the web. It's a specific ad hoc API. When you create a server in Node.js and you want to close it because you got like an exit signal, it's .close. There are many ways to cancel APIs, and what I have seen in code bases, especially like even in Microsoft, but especially when companies who started adopting Node talk to me about their APIs, is stuff like this. You would have an endpoint, like get some endpoint, and that endpoint calls an API. It can be promises, it can be callbacks, it doesn't matter. When you call that API, like sometimes the connection will close. So there is like a response here. The response is coming from the user. The user has already left your website. And now you are trying to write data to that user, which is wasteful and an error and will cause all sorts of problems. And this is like, I have not seen a single Node code base that like didn't have these sort of bugs. And it's on the platform. Like, I don't blame the users. It's not reasonable to expect users to know how to handle these intricate resource handling use cases all the time. And users just ignored it. Like you'd have, this is another like regular flow. I oversimplified it obviously, but you have like a query from a database, and then you like get more data from the database and from the API, and you return it. And this method is not cancellation aware at all. If the DB query isn't needed anymore, you still get the data from the API. It's again wasteful, it's slow, and it's not great. It also obviously creates race conditions. I am using this example not because I like it, but because it's a famous one. When you do an autocomplete, the number one error, and like Windows 10, for example, did this, when you start typing text, usually this, like the fewer letters you have, the longer it will take the backend to return the result. So people like start writing in their autocomplete on their like, in this case, on the browser, and by the time they like write the whole thing, it goes to the server, it returns the data, and like they get updated data. Like all that time, all the request for the like shorter search term is still running. And in this case, like let's say you're searching for NodeTLV, so your first query is N, it's probably going to be the last to return if you're a fast typist, which is not only wasteful, it will show you incorrect results. So this is like a famous example of this particular timing bug, but it's not specific to browsers or to autocompletes. It's every time you have like changing input and you need to react to it. And of course, you can work around this without cancellation. You can wrap this type ahead function with another function that only takes the last value. But that's not ideal because you still perform all the API requests. So I want to provide some historical background about like how we even got to talk about cancellation. What's the point? Basically, from our perspective, I was working on Bluebird. Like the people working on promises back then were always called names. We were told it's not going to work. No one's going to use promises. Promises are broken. You should use callbacks. We already have a thing for this. We don't need the other thing. And we started seriously talking about cancellation in the language when we pretty much won. That means there was a recent survey. It showed more people are using promises than callbacks for the first time. That was huge for us. We had mugs. The NPM downloads were climbing. Native promises were getting implemented. We were getting feedback from engines willing to work on this and iterate. And basically, everything was going well. There was a bunch of people in the project in Node.js that didn't like promises. A lot of new people who do like promises came in. And they sort of worked on getting promises to work better in Node and promises to work great in Node now. And we were, I think, overly optimistic. We thought, hey, promises were way harder. Cancellation is going to be easy peasy. The first attempts to do cancellation, so those of you who don't know, the first real big promise library in JavaScript is Q. Promises came to JavaScript through Twisted, through other languages, through Python, eventually through a language called E in the 80s. But like the first major implementation in JavaScript was Q by Chris. And Q didn't address this. They had a really interesting notion of progress, but they didn't have a notion of cancellation. And then Petka came with Bluebird, and he said, hey, we really need cancellation. Cancellation is super important. We need it. And very big consumers of Bluebird, like let's say WhatsApp, use this extensively. The way cancellation worked in Bluebird 2 is that you had this method that's like .cancelable, and that made a promise cancelable. And then cancellation was, so those of you who don't know Bluebird, which makes sense, there was a concept of typed catch. You could tell it what type of errors to catch. Hopefully, we'll get this in JavaScript someday. And you would say, hey, if the error you got is cancellation, like do an xhr.abort and throw the error. So it gave you, for the first time, the ability to react to cancellation as cancellation. Every promise had to be made cancelable. It wasn't the default. And if you wanted to cancel it, you would just call .cancel on the promise. So it's .cancelable, make it cancelable. That adds the cancel method, which is kind of quirky. And then cancellation is an error. This worked. It worked enough to power WhatsApp Web and other big services, but it contained many problems. First, it wasn't obvious how to aggregate, like how do I cancel a promise.all or promise.raise. This was very problematic. Now, I want to talk about the pros and cons in Bluebird 2 cancellation, but I want to show you Bluebird 3 cancellation first. Now, this is already old. It's probably like from 2015, but it was innovative back then. The way it worked is the promise constructor got a third argument. There is resolve, there is reject, which is, by the way, totally redundant. You can pass like a rejected promise to resolve, and then there is onCancel. And onCancel takes a callback of how do I react to cancellation. And this is a simpler API. You had to opt into cancellation at the promise library level. You do Bluebird config cancellation true. And then you would do on cancel and tell it to abort the network request, which was cool and worked and was fun. This is interesting. The reason it's interesting is because Bluebird 3 cancellation, if you notice Bluebird 2, cancellation is an error here. Like, it's just another type of exception. You throw a cancellation error, or like an abort error, as we'll see later. In Bluebird 3, it used something called third state cancellation, which means it runs finally blocks, and it doesn't run anything but finally blocks. And it means that cancellation is not an error. You have a successful completion that's fulfilled. You have unsuccessful completion that's rejected. And you have cancellation, which is an entirely separate third state that only runs finally blocks. And this was kind of innovative because it solved a lot of the problems I'll show in a minute. It did solve aggregation. You could cancel a promise.all or promise.raise, and it all worked seamlessly, and it was nice. It worked well. It was really a good cancellation method. And one of the core things about it is it signaled disinterest. Like, if you cancel a promise and like the promise doesn't have any like on-cancel handler, it just ignores it. It doesn't call the then handlers. It will call the finally, but it won't abort the operation itself. There are two mechanics for cancellation, broadly speaking. One is termination, like I am going to kill the thread. Those of you who do Rust, for example, Rust has this sort of with dropping stuff semantic. And the other is disinterest. It's like, I don't care about the result. Just don't call my callbacks, and I'm going to do fine. And this is what pretty much every cancellation scheme in JavaScript does. So what was wrong with Bluebird 2? Why did we have to go from this to this? Basically, cancellation is errors in Bluebird 2. I'm going to quote a discussion I had with member in the old cancellation repo. I said, I don't want cancellation as errors. I am currently using C#. C# has cancellation as errors. It woke me up like in the middle of the night twice the last week when I had cancellation. Find a way to my error handling monitoring library. And like, if someone cancels a request, suddenly it wakes the developer at night. It conflates two ideas, like an error state and cancellation. Like, a cancellation is not a bad thing. You know that errors, like doing control flow through exceptions is considered bad. Cancellation is not an error, fundamentally. It was also async, which is problematic. Some APIs you really need to cancel synchronously. It created timing issues. Yeah, but that's fine. So like, everyone was happy. The third state Bluebird, the way Bluebird worked, was cool. Sorry. The way it worked was cool. It was useful. Everyone was happy. So obviously, they went and started to work on specifying this. There was an attempt to make promises cancelable. And again, Bluebird promises have been cancelable for 8 years. So it's not like it's fundamentally hard. It's pretty simple to add the capability to promises. But it received objections I will cover shortly. Now, I want to cover like a nuance in JavaScript, an odd fact. When cancelable promises were being worked on, and I will give you the spoiler, we don't have cancelable promises, right? Other features in the language were worked on. One of the features was generators. Generators have third state semantics. They are the only feature in the language, generators and async generators, with this very interesting semantic. If you have a generator and you call .return on it, it will run finally blocks, but no catch handlers, which is the one place in the language that does this, I believe, both in anticipation of an old observable proposal that never came to fruition, and because of cancelable promises and third state semantics. And this is good. Like, this enabled Bluebird to implement generators like coroutines using third state semantics, because it's already built into generators. So the attempt failed. I'll make the long story short. People didn't like cancelable promises. I think, like many features in the language, it was more miscommunication than anything. A lot of people just didn't understand them. The main reason was action at a distance. Like, people said, a promise is the capability to like listen to a result at a future point. I don't want to give, and like, a promise is not an action. You can't like do a promise. A promise is already like a listener for the result. People didn't want to give promises the capability to perform actions like cancellation. Now, even though it was disinterest semantics and like the action wasn't observable. People still didn't like it. There are disagreements about what happened in that meeting. Some people say it was a good idea and like it just needed more work. Some people say there was fundamental disagreement. I think that was a mistake. I think cancelable promises were the best chance we had for reasonable semantics. It was the cancellation semantics we didn't deserve, honestly. It was good, it worked, and it had all of the benefits and none of the drawbacks. The main problem with third state semantics, the old proposal, is that the old proposal was very ambitious and it introduced like something that was too hard for the language, I think, to easily add. Then there were a few years that were just awful. People were complaining that observables were cancelable and promises were not. Now, an observable is fundamentally different, by the way. It's like it's more like a function call than a value. But people were complaining about that. Fetch was the primary new low-level API for making web requests, and people wanted it to work. And this happened. Basically, like the fetch repo, everyone was depressed. Everyone was like, we were blocked on cancelable promises. We're not going to get those. What's going to happen? I want to talk a bit about the WHATWG contribution cycle. I was involved in that discussion. And like, I was involved in Node back then, but WHATWG didn't care about Node back then, to be honest. And like, these people were very nice and inclusive to me. I just said, hey, this is interesting. Can I attend? And they were like, sure. And they even adjusted the meeting time so I can attend. And they didn't owe me anything. They didn't know me, these people back then. This was like several years ago. So huge props to them. They didn't have any incentive to be inclusive to me, and they were. So props to them. Super appreciative, really nice people. The meeting went well with a depressing conclusion. We need an API for cancellation. We don't care what the API is. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be ergonomic. We just need an API for cancellation because it's frustrating. There is no way to cancel things in DOM APIs. That's standard. And this was like a first attempt. Everyone wanted to have cancellation already. People were tired of waiting. And everyone was saying the web is about capabilities. We just need to give the capability to cancel things. A board controller took a lot less time to design than cancelable promises. You took an API that took years to design, like cancelable promises, and replaced it with one of the simplest ways to implement it, with a big trade-off. This is like one of the first, this is Jake, one of the people who worked on Fetch. He still does. And you can see like the fetch controller, that's like a primitive version of an abort controller that listens to board things. And finally, it worked. Like I'm going to cut the story because of time limitations, but eventually, very quickly, like a month, not years, Fetch was cancelable. Fetch got a signal property. Those of you who don't know, you create a new controller, then you pass it the signal, and then when you abort the controller, everything gets automatically aborted. And this worked. Right? This is a solid API. It has all the drawbacks of Bluebird too. Like it uses an exception and abort error to signal cancellation, which is unfortunate, but it's also simpler, way simpler. You need to specify a lot less things. And this was the end. But this isn't a fetch talk. I didn't like this is cancellation overhaul in Node.js. This was just historical background until now. So why is Door still so infatuated with jQuery? So Node.js has been making an effort to align with web APIs. That's like a strategic initiative. We have been working on adding web APIs to the core, like URL. And there is like this long-term initiative, and Ethan will talk about it later, to add fetch or enable it to Node.js. Because it's useful. People want to be able to fetch from Node. That's a very much ongoing effort you can be involved in. And one of those things to add fetch, because fetch uses a board controller, right? That's why a board controller exists, is to add a board controller and a board signal. There's web streams that were also added for it. Not going to talk about it. It's a whole different full talk. But Node had to add two things for it. One of those is event target. That's like the event emitter web thing that's really interesting and is a whole other talk. I won't get into it. And a board signal and a board controller. And a board signal and a board controller are the web's primitives for cancellation. And now they're also Node's primitive for cancellation. So James, that's someone from the org, started iterating on it. eventually, initially, there were a lot of issues. For example, he started basing it on event emitter and not event target, which is not spec compliant, because implementing event target is a lot of work, and work started. It took a lot of work to make Node's abort controller spec compliant, which is unfortunate. I would want people to be able to use a abort controller in their own JavaScript runtimes easily. The initial reaction was not positive. Like, people were criticizing us because it's like there is a lot of miscommunication when you start working on things and you don't do well the first time. Like, he was complaining about, for example, non-standard extensions and such, which is annoying. But I totally get him. Like, from his point of view, we talked about one thing and then we did another thing. So communication is hard. Number one tip: always assume the people working with are are working in good faith with you, and spend I want to say an emotional investment to work with the people involved, because eventually, this dude Dominic was very helpful in this implementation. He provided a ton of feedback. He found a lot of bugs, and he moved from this. I'm frustrated, this is disappointing, this is not what we should do, to this, I'm very excited with how this is turning out, very quickly. And even afterwards, he would still go in and find bugs. And those were real, considerable, meaningful bugs that needed to be fixed before we landed this. So just working with people and spending the emotional investment to interact in good faith was totally worth it. And it turned out to be super useful. I had just 15 PRs just to fix the edge cases he mentioned here. So I think maybe half of my PRs in Node at this point are just event emitter fixes. If anyone noticed, Dominic was referencing, I told him, we talked about Dino, and I said Dino's event target and abort controller aren't spec compliant. I also went ahead and fixed those. So these are all my Node PRs and my Dino PRs fixing mostly the same things. Because it turns out it's a really tricky API. And eventually, in November, almost a year ago, the initial experimental implementation landed. And since Node.js 15, a board controller arrived, and we have a unified, concrete way to cancel things. And Node also worked on improving a board signal. One of the cool things about web standards is you would have people come to the WHATWG repo and ask for features, and then if they're interesting enough for browsers, they would go ahead and implement those. So these are just two examples. This is very much an ongoing effort. If you use a board signal or board controller and you're not happy with the behavior or the debugging experience, please open an issue. These things, these are both things that were upstreamed from Node.js to the internet, to the web. And this is very much ongoing work. There's open PRs right now to improve a board controller and a board signal in Node.js. It's not 17 hours because I updated the slide yesterday, but it's from yesterday. It's really cool. So can we use a board signal as a cancellation primitive everywhere? I don't know why it says for. Yes, we can. We added support for a board controller everywhere. All the APIs in Node.js support a board controller now. You can, for example, do an http.get and pass it in a board signal, just like you would a fetch. You can child process.exec, start a new process, and pass it in a board signal, like you would anywhere else. You can listen to a server and pass it in a board signal. So when the signal is, the controller is aborted, the server closes. You can read files and pass them a board signal. So pretty much every API in Node.js supports this. And I want to call out, I want to say this was also a collaborative effort. I didn't make all these PRs. I don't see Nitzan or Odo here, but they worked on that. Many people contributed to those APIs, adding tests, making them stable, finding bugs. Streams, that's another one. Streams support a board signal. Basically, the core primitive for streaming data in Node is unsurprisingly streams. You can attach an abort signal to a stream safely, and when the controller is finished, it will abort, it will destroy the stream. Now, this is important because if you really don't care very much about performance and you want very readable, nice code, you should use for await with your streams. It's very nice. There is for await, there's pipelines that enable composition. I think there's also compose now. And you should use these APIs. A board controller allows dealing with cancellation in those APIs in a pretty easy way. You can wrap other APIs. You honestly shouldn't. Most APIs should already support a bot controller. We worked very hard. But the way you do this is you add event listener, AS, and that's add event listener like the web, like front end, like an abort event to the abort signal you get, and you pass it the listener. And please, 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 this is a bug we had 4 times in Node.js itself. It's tricky to write. Make sure you don't make the same mistakes we did. Always clean the event listener when you, like when the resource finishes, because you would see event like signals with many listeners. And we have a trick inside core where we have weak event listeners that like don't interfere with garbage collections, but that's not exposed to user land. So please be very careful when writing these sort of APIs. So abort signal isn't great. There's no third state. Cancellation has errors. It's based on event target, which is tricky. Many things are tricky in it, like composition, cleanup. It's not a great API, but the web is about capabilities. Once we have this API, we can improve it. We can work on it. We can make it a lot more debuggable and fun. Abort signal is cross-platform. Browsers use it, Node uses it, runtimes use it. It's fully specified, it's supported, it's relatively easy to contribute to. It works, and you can use it today to write async APIs with cancellation. So Node.js has a standard cancellation primitive. Gonna give you a throwback. What about TC39? That's the people specifying the language. There were efforts to standardize cancellation in TC39. The effort is happening here at the proposal cancellation repo. Do we still need that, though? That's a good question. We already have an API that works both in Node.js and the browsers. Do we still need a cross-platform cancellation primitive if we have one? So Chrome says no. Chrome says we don't need anything from the language. We already have a cross-platform cancellation primitive. I am honestly not sure if we should or shouldn't work on this. Discussion is ongoing. Again, this is very much work in progress. But we are probably going to stay with abort signal, abort controller in the coming future, and it's definitely going to be supported like for good. So the future. So we have promises, we have async functions, we have abort controller. We don't have anything for resource management, disposers. That's like try using in Java, using in C#, that sort of thing. So I believe that's where things are going to be in the future. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. Use a bot controller in your code for new code. Migrate existing code. And you are welcome, honestly, and to participate in the process and provide feedback so we can improve. I don't have time for questions because I have 10 seconds. I'm just going to say thank you.